She saw everyone ignore the Mafia boss's autistic son until she asked him to dance. Before we dive into the story, tell me where in the world you're watching from, and if this story steals your heart, please hit subscribe. Alara's feet were aching, a dull throb that radiated from her heels to her calves, the price of cheap flats and 12 hours on marble. She stood in the shadow of a Corinthian pillar, just outside the main pulse of the DeLuca Foundation Gala. From here, she could see everything. She saw the mayor schmoozing, the city councilors bowing, and the old money matrons pretending not to notice the faint, dangerous chill that clung to their host. And she saw the host, Milan DeLuca, a man who owned the steel in the buildings, the ships in the harbor, and the politicians in the room. He moved through the crowd like a panther, all tailored midnight blue suit and controlled force, a black sapphire glinting on his wrist. He smiled, but it never reached his eyes. His eyes, Alara noticed, were never on his guests. They were always scanning the edges of the room, near the terrace doors, where a small boy in a matching blue suit stood rigid, his hands clamped over a pair of large, noise-canceling headphones. This was the part of the job Alara hated, the people. Not the logistics. She loved the flow charts, the sound cues, the lighting plots. It was the calculated blindness of the wealthy. They flowed around the boy like water around a rock, a collective, polite ignorance. He was 10, maybe 12, and clearly in sensory distress. The thrum of the orchestra, the high-pitched laughter, the clash of perfume and champagne, it was a sensory assault. Alara watched him rock, just slightly, his fingers twisting a silver ring on his thumb. This was Matteo DeLuca, the heir to the city's most dangerous and powerful fortune, and he was completely alone in a room of 500 people. Then Alara saw his father again. Milan DeLuca had stopped, his conversation with a senator cut short. He was watching his son, and for a fleeting second, the mask of the untouchable chief executive officer cracked. Alara saw a raw, agonizing helplessness in his face, the look of a man who could command armies, but could not ease the suffering of his own child. Alara made a decision. It was probably stupid. It was probably career suicide. She slipped away from her pillar, heading not for the boy, but for the sound booth tucked behind the orchestra. "Gary," she said into her headset, "I need a dead zone. Sector 4 by the terrace doors. Drop the monitors, bring the ambient down 5 decibels. Now." The sound engineer, bless him, just did it. The oppressive swell of the music receded, creating a small pocket of relative quiet. She walked slowly toward the boy, not looking at him directly, but at the intricate light patterns the crystal chandeliers were throwing on the floor. "They're beautiful, aren't they?" she said, her voice soft. "The light, it's moving in a waltz time. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The boy, Matteo, flinched but didn't look up. His hands tightened on his headphones. Alara stopped a few feet away and knelt, pulling her scuffed flats under her soft rose gown. She dug into the deep pocket of her event binder, past pens and timelines, and pulled out a small, wind-up metronome. It was simple, plastic, and worn. She twisted the key and set the weight, a slow, steady largo. Tick, tock, tick. Matteo's head tilted. He was watching the metronome's steady swing. "It's a counter," Alara said, her voice matching the rhythm. "It just helps you find the beat when the world is too loud. See, 1, 2, 3. She held out her hand, palm up. "My name is Alara. I get overwhelmed by all this too. Sometimes it helps to just count. May I show you?" He watched her hand for a full minute. Then, in a small, hesitant movement, he placed his fingers in her palm. His hand was trembling. Alara didn't squeeze. She just rose, gently drawing him a few steps further into the sound-deadened corner. "We just move with the count," she whispered. 1, 2, 3 step. 1, 2, 3 step. She led him in a simple, shuffling box step, her hand a warm, steady anchor. His shoulders, which had been up by his ears, began to drop. He matched her count, his feet moving with hers. He even let out a small, quiet breath that sounded almost like a laugh. He was still in his world, but she had been invited in, and he was safe there. Across the ballroom, Milan DeLuca felt the air leave his lungs. He had watched the woman in the rose gown approach his son, his hand instinctively moving to the cold metal he carried under his suit jacket, a protective instinct so ingrained it was like breathing. He had watched her kneel. He had watched her produce the small, ticking object. And then the impossible happened. He watched his son, his Matteo, who flinched from his own nannies, who tolerated his father's touch only on good days, willingly take her hand. He watched them dance, a simple, shuffling movement in the shadows. He watched his son's face lose its pinched, terrified expression and soften into simple concentration. The senator beside him was still talking, something about zoning permits. Milan put a hand on the man's shoulder, a grip that was just hard enough to stop the words instantly. The room, the noise, the entire city dissolved. There was only that corner, the woman with the kind eyes and scuffed shoes, and his son, who was, for the first time in public, simply dancing. The music swelled for the finale, and Alara knew her time was up. The gala was ending. She and Matteo slowed to a stop, though she kept the metronome ticking. "See, you were perfect," she murmured. He gave her a quick, shy smile, a flash of brilliance before retreating back into himself. "Alara!" The name was spoken behind her, a low gravel that vibrant through the floor. She turned, her heart lurching. Milan De Luca was 2 feet away, his presence an absolute vacuum, sucking all the air and light from their quiet corner. He was taller than she'd realized, his shoulders blocking the ballroom. His eyes were a dark, unreadable gray, and they weren't looking at her, but at where her hand still rested on Matteo's arm. She dropped it immediately. "Sir, I was just—" He held up a hand. Silence. He looked at his son. "Matteo, it is time to go." Matteo nodded, tapped his fidget ring twice, and walked to his father's side, slipping his hand into Milan's. Milan De Luca then turned his full, terrifying attention to Alara. She felt pinned like an insect under glass. He noted her gown, her messy chignon, her steady, if slightly frightened, brown eyes and the cheap flats. He looked at the metronome in her hand. "You are with the hotel catering staff?" he asked. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "No, sir, I'm a junior event planner with the foundation." He nodded slowly. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit, the movement precise, and produced a wallet. From it, he pulled a single card. It was black, impossibly heavy cardstock with only a name embossed in silver. Milan De Luca. No title, no company, just the name and a number. He pressed it into her hand. His fingers were calloused, his touch sending a jolt through her skin. "My office will telephone you tomorrow morning at 9. Be available." It was not a request. It was a command. He turned, one hand on his son's shoulder, and they were gone, a phalanx of security guards materializing from the shadows to escort them. Alara was left standing in the corner, her heart hammering against her ribs, the heavy card in her hand, and the faint scent of sandalwood and danger lingering in the air. The summons came at 8:59 the next morning. Alara was in her tiny, cluttered apartment, nursing a cup of coffee, the black card sitting on her kitchen counter like a threat. A crisp, female voice informed her that Mr. De Luca required her presence at the De Luca Tower at 10. A car was already waiting downstairs. Alara dressed quickly, not in a gown, but in her best professional attire, a simple black sheath dress and a blazer, her curls pulled back. The car was a black sedan with tinted windows that whispered through the city's old-world streets, crossing into the gleaming, modern financial district. The De Luca Tower was a monument of glass and steel, a spear piercing the coastal sky. She was escorted to a private elevator, which opened directly into Milan De Luca's penthouse office. It was the opposite of the warm, candle-lit gala. This room was cold, precise, and silent, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a godlike view of the city and harbor below. Milan was not behind his massive stone desk. He was standing at the window, hands clasped behind his back, a figure of absolute authority. "Miss Alara," he said without turning, "you made an impression last night." She swallowed, her hands clasped in front of her. "I was only trying to help Matteo." He turned then, and his gaze was sharp, analytical. He was sizing her up, and she felt the same chill as the night before. "You did not treat him like he was fragile. You did not pity him. You gave him a tool. You gave him a rhythm." He walked to his desk and gestured for her to sit, though he remained standing. The De Luca Foundation hosts 38 events per year. Fundraisers, galas, auctions, and community blessings at the cathedral. From now on, you will oversee all of them. Alara blinked. "Sir, I'm a junior planner. I don't have that authority." He cut her off. "You do now. You will be given an independent consultant contract. Your new title is Director of Event Protocol. You will report only to me. Your compensation will be significant. Your first task is to redesign every event to be, as you would say, sensory-friendly." The number he named was staggering. It was life-changing. It was enough to make her say yes without thinking. But Alara, despite her scuffed flats, was not weak. She saw the truth of the situation. This wasn't just a job, this was a purchase. He was hearing her to be a shield, a buffer for his son. "No," she said, the word quiet but firm in the vast, silent office. Milan's eyebrow twitched, the only sign of his surprise. "I will not be a consultant," Alara continued, her voice gaining strength. "A consultant can be dismissed. If I am to do this, I require full autonomy. Final say on lighting, on sound design, on guest capacity, and on staggered entry times for all events. No overrides, not even from you. My protocols will be mandatory." She was terrified. She had just talked back to the most dangerous man in the city. Milan stared at her, a long, unnerving silence stretching between them. Then a small, cold smile touched his lips. "You are either very brave, Miss Alara, or very foolish." He walked back to the window. "You have your terms. The contract will be drawn up, but first you must meet the client properly." He led her from the office, not to the elevator, but up a private glass staircase to the penthouse proper. This space was warmer, still modern stone and glass, but softened with deep velvet furniture and, surprisingly, shelves filled with books and intricate models of trains. On a vast, windswept terrace, Matteo was sitting at a table, headphones on, sketching intently in a large pad. He looked up as they approached, and when he saw Alara, his face lit with that same rare, bright smile. "You came," he said. "I brought the counter," Alara replied, pulling the metronome from her bag. She set it on the table between them. Tick, tock, tick. Matteo immediately relaxed, turning his sketchbook to her. "This is the schedule for the coastal high-speed rail. The 10:42 from the central station is always late on Tuesdays because it has to wait for the 10:38 freight to clear the junction at Martino Bridge. It's an inefficient design." Alara sat, genuinely fascinated. "You're right. They should have built a flyover. Why haven't they?" Milan stood back, watching them. He watched this woman, who had defied him moments before, now listen with rapt attention as his son explained the intricate physics of railway switching. He had poured millions into therapies, specialists, and schools, and none of them had ever connected with Matteo like this. This woman, with her steady voice and the simple, ticking toy, had unlocked something in his son. She had unlocked something in him. He found himself listening to the steady beat of the metronome, a simple, predictable rhythm in his chaotic, violent world. It was a lifeline. And as he watched Alara laugh at something Matteo said, a fierce, dark possessiveness settled in his chest. As she was leaving, hours later, he stopped her at the elevator. His demeanor was no longer the cold chief executive officer. It was something else, darker. "You are in my world now, Alara," he said, his voice a low warning. "The people who attend my galas, the people I do business with, they are not kind. They will see you with me, with my son. They will see you as a vulnerability or a target." He brushed a stray curl from her face, his scarred knuckle grazing her cheek. "What I protect, I keep. Do you understand?" Alara understood perfectly. The contract was a cage, gilded and beautiful, but a cage nonetheless. And the door had just locked behind her. The next few weeks were a blur of logistics and tension. Alara moved into a new office at the De Luca Tower, a sleek, minimalist space 2 floors below Milan's penthouse. Her old boss had simply been informed she was no longer available, a transition handled with the bloodless, terrifying efficiency of the De Luca machine. Alara threw herself into the work, drafting what she called the quiet protocols. She designed sensory-friendly side rooms for every venue, complete with weighted blankets, reduced lighting, and sound-dampening panels. She mandated that music never exceed a certain decibel level and arranged for staggered arrival times so that guests like Matteo would not have to endure the crush of a receiving line. Her biggest project, however, was a small, private fundraiser to be held at a riverside dance studio, a beautiful, old building with dark hardwood floors and high, arched windows. It was her first true test. Milan was present. He reviewed her plans, his sharp eyes missing nothing, but he was also distant, the formidable boss, until she made a new request. "I want to teach you," she said one evening, finding him alone in his penthouse office, staring at the city lights. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Teach me what? How to approve a budget? I assure you I am proficient." Alara shook her head, pulling the metronome from her bag. It had become a permanent fixture. "How to dance. The count 10 step. If you're going to host a quiet event, you should know the rhythm." He scoffed, a harsh, dry sound. "I do not dance, Alara." "It's not for you," she said softly. "It's for Matteo. He needs an anchor. If he sees you doing it, he'll feel safe. He needs you to be his partner, not just me." That struck home. The iron control in his face flickered, replaced by that same raw vulnerability she'd seen at the gala. He nodded. Once. They met at the Riverside studio late at night, long after the last ballet class had ended. The only lights were a few dim floods, casting long shadows on the polished floor. The city outside was a muted glitter. Alara had her metronome, but she also had a small speaker. She put on a slow, instrumental waltz, the music barely a whisper. "All right," she said, facing him. "Give me your hand." He stood stiffly, a man in a perfectly tailored suit who looked more comfortable in a boardroom war than here. He held out his hand as if offering it for a handshake. Alara smiled, taking it and placing it on her waist. His hand was large, warm, and heavy. He flinched as if burned. "I don't. SHH, just listen." She placed her own hand on his chest, directly over his heart. She could feel its steady, powerful beat beneath the fine wool. "Feel the count, Milan. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. It's just like the metronome, it's just a rhythm." He was impossibly stiff. He was a man made of controlled violence and rigid discipline, and this simple, soft movement was alien to him. "You are leading," she murmured, "but you are fighting it. Stop thinking, just count." They moved in awkward, shuffling circles, the only sound their feet on the hardwood and the faint music. The scent of his sandalwood cologne was overwhelming in the quiet space, mixing with the simple, clean scent of her own soap. "You're a man of action, Milan," she said, looking up at him. His sharp jaw was set, his focus intense. "You're used to force. This isn't force. This is a current. You just have to join it." She pressed her hand slightly firmer against his chest. "Breathe. 1, 2, 3. And then it happened. He let out a long, slow breath, his shoulders dropping a fraction, and he fell into step. He was no longer fighting her, but moving with her. He was a natural, of course. His power translated into a surprising grace, his steps firm and sure. He led her across the floor, and the dynamic shifted. He was in control, but he was using her rhythm to do it. The song ended, but they didn't stop. They just stood in the center of the empty room, his hand on her waist, hers on his chest. The silence was deafening, filled with everything unspoken between them. His gaze dropped from her eyes to her mouth, and she felt a jolt of heat, sharp and dangerous. He was a predator, and she had just taught him a new, gentle way to hunt. He practiced what she taught him. A few nights later, she was at the penthouse for a final walkthrough of the fundraiser, a pretext she now recognized. Matteo was there, and the new, larger brass and wood metronome she had bought for him was ticking on the mantel. "Matteo," Milan said, his voice softer than Alara had ever heard it. "May I have this dance?" He offered his hand, just as Alara had. Matteo looked at him, surprised, then at Alara, who nodded. He took his father's hand. Milan began to count, his voice low. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. He led his son in the simple box step, his large, scarred hand holding Matteo's small one. It was hesitant, it was clumsy, but it was happening. Matteo leaned his head against his father's suit jacket for just a second, a small, trusting gesture that made Alara's heart ache. Milan looked at Alara over his son's head, and the raw, burning gratitude in his eyes was so intense it was almost a violation. It was a look that stripped her bare, thanking her for giving him back a piece of his son. Later, after Matteo had gone to bed, they stood on the terrace. The metronome was still ticking from the living room, its steady beat a new soundtrack to their lives. The air was cool, the city a galaxy of lights below. "You gave him a gift," Milan said, his voice a low rumble. "You gave me a gift." Alara shook her head. "You did the work, I just gave you the count." The tension that had been humming between them since the studio, since the first gala, was now a physical, throbbing thing. He hadn't touched her since their lesson, but she felt his presence like a brand. "Why are you not afraid of me, Alara?" he asked, turning to face her. "Everyone else is." She met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm terrified of you, Milan, but I'm not afraid of the man who dances with his son." That broke the last of his control. He didn't move toward her slowly. It was a collision. He closed the distance in one step, his hand tangling in her hair, tilting her head back. His other arm locked around her waist, pulling her flush against his hard body. His kiss was not soft. It was not gentle. It was a raw, desperate claiming, a release of all the pent-up tension, fear, and a terrifying, unfamiliar tenderness. He kissed her like he was starving, his mouth hard and demanding, the scar on his knuckle rough against her jaw. It was a kiss of possession, of desperation, and Alara, to her own shock, kissed him back, her hands clinging to his suit jacket, anchoring herself in the storm. The small, quiet fundraiser at the dance studio was a success. The quiet protocol worked. Guests with sensory needs, invited personally by Alara through community outreach, mingled with Milan's high-powered donors in an environment of unprecedented calm. Milan and Matteo even shared a brief, perfect dance, a moment that the press, carefully curated by Alara, captured with respectful distance. For a few weeks, there was a sense of peace. Alara and Milan fell into a dangerous, unspoken rhythm. Late-night meetings at the penthouse became the norm, stolen hours on the terrace after Matteo was asleep, where the darkness and the steady tick of the metronome allowed them to exist outside their defined roles. Their relationship was intense, a fragile thing built in the shadows, fueled by whispered conversations and desperate, hungry kisses that always felt like a prelude to a storm. Alara knew what he was. She saw the hardness in him, the ruthlessness that made him the city's king. But she had also seen the man who learned to waltz for his son. The storm broke on a Tuesday. Alara was in her office when her phone began to buzz incessantly. A rival media outlet, one known for its gutter-level tactics, had published an article. DeLuca Air unstable. Shocking footage shows foundation gala meltdown. Alara's blood ran cold. She clicked the link. It was grainy, zoomed-in security footage from the first gala, cruelly edited to show only Matteo's deepest distress. His rocking, his hands clamped over his ears, his face pinched in pain. It cut off just before Alara had approached him. It was a character assassination, aimed not at Milan but at his son. She ran for the private elevator, her heart pounding. When she entered the penthouse, the silence was absolute, heavier and more terrifying than any shout. Milan was standing at the window, just as he had been the first day she arrived. But this was not the controlled chief executive officer. This was the Mafia boss. He was radiating a cold, pure rage that made the air in the room feel thin. "Milan," she said, her voice shaking. "They're already in a car," he said, his voice lethally soft. "Who?" "The men who leaked this, the men who run the paper, and the man who paid them, Giuseppe Rossi." The Rossis were an old-guard rival family, one Milan had been systematically dismantling in his business dealings. This was their retaliation, and they had chosen the one target Milan could not defend with guns or money. "You're going to kill them," Alara stated. It wasn't a question. "I am going to erase them," he corrected, his voice devoid of any emotion. "I am going to burn their homes, seize their assets, and make their names a whisper. They put their hands on my son." He was going to start a war that would pull him down, that would splatter his son's name with more blood and shame. "No," Alara said, stepping in front of him, planting her feet. "You can't." His eyes, gray and cold as the sea, snapped to hers. "Get out of my way, Alara." "Oh," she said, louder this time, her fear eclipsed by a sudden, fierce clarity. "You do that, you burn them down, and you prove them right. You prove that the DeLuca family is unstable, that you rule with violence, that your son is a weakness to be hidden. You will be confirming everything they wrote." His face was a mask of fury. "What is your alternative, strategist? A strongly worded press release?" "Yes," she shot back, her mind racing. "No, better, a gala. The main gala. The one everyone is watching. We are going to announce the DeLuca Quiet Hour. We're going to make it the centerpiece of the event. We are going to partner with the city's top neurodiversity foundations. You are going to donate a fortune. And I am going to give an interview, not as your employee, but as the designer of the protocol. You don't fight this with violence, Milan. You fight it with light. You turn their disgusting little spotlight into a stage, and you own it." He stared at her, the rage in his eyes warring with a dawning, shocked respect. He saw the fire in her, the same strategic brilliance she used for logistics, now aimed at his enemies. He was a man of shadows, and she was, impossibly, a woman of light. He nodded, the movement sharp. "Do it!" The next 48 hours were a blur. Alara, backed by the full, terrifying power of the DeLuca public relations and legal teams, flipped the narrative. The story changed from DeLuca Air to DeLuca Foundation champions neurodiversity. Her interview, calm, steady, and passionate, went viral. She spoke of how strength came in many forms, how diversity included neurology. She never mentioned Matteo. She didn't have to. She had turned the Rossis attack into a citywide triumph. The victory felt good, until Alara returned to her own apartment, the one she had kept despite Milan's offers. The lock was broken. She pushed the door open, her heart in her throat. The apartment wasn't ransacked. It was precise. Her sofa cushions were sliced open. A single photo of her and her parents was shattered on the floor, and in the center of her small living room, her original plastic metronome, the one she had used with Mateo at the first gala, was smashed into a dozen pieces. A message. They hadn't touched her, but they had touched her world. They were telling her she was not untouchable. She was still on the phone with Milan's security when he burst through the door himself, his face pale with a new, colder fury. He saw the room, saw the broken metronome in her trembling hand, and his control snapped. "That's it, you're done." He was already on his phone, arranging a jet, a private island, a security detail. "You're leaving tonight. I will keep you safe." Alara looked at the broken pieces in her hand, the small object that had started everything. She looked at this powerful, terrified man who knew only one way to protect, to possess, to control, to hide. "No," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. He stopped, staring at her. "Alara, this is not a negotiation. They were in your home. And you think hiding me will stop them? You think they don't know I'm yours? Hiding me just tells them I'm a weakness. I am not your weakness, Milan." She walked over to him, holding up the shattered plastic. "They targeted us, not just you, not just Mateo, not just me, us. We move as one. You don't get to send me away." He looked staggered, his rage and fear warring with the sheer, stubborn force of her. "They will kill you," he whispered, the words raw. "Then they will have to get through you," she replied, her hand coming up to cup his sharp jaw. "But I am not running. We finish this, together. Count it with me, Milan. 1, 2, 3. We stay on the beat." He closed his eyes, pulling her into a brutal, desperate embrace, burying his face in her hair. He was holding onto her, his anchor in the storm, and he knew she was right. She was no longer just a planner. She was a partner, and the Rosses had just made the last mistake of their lives. The meeting was set for a neutral location, a private, vaulted conference room at a bank that Milan effectively owned. It was a truce meeting, one the Rossi patriarch, Giuseppe, had been forced to accept. Alara's public relations victory had been so absolute that it had painted the Rosses as cruel predators, and Milan's subsequent, silent, and surgical attacks on their shipping lines had crippled them. They were coming to surrender. Milan, flanked by his two most trusted men, looked like a king holding court, his midnight blue suit a perfect armor. Alara had insisted on being there. "I am the reason they are here," she had argued. "They targeted me. I will see the end of it." Milan had relented, and she sat at the table, not behind him, but beside him. Her presence was a silent, powerful statement. Her final, non-negotiable condition had been the most shocking. Mateo was here. He was not at the table, but in a small, adjoining glass-walled office, sitting with his sketchbook and his headphones. "He will not be hidden," Alara had told a furious Milan. "He will not be the source of shame. He will be present. He will see his father win, from a safe distance." The Rossi contingent arrived, old Giuseppe Rossi, his volatile son, and their lawyers. The air was thick with decades of bad blood, the scent of old cigars and new fear. Rossi was a man from an older, more brutal generation, and he looked at Alara with open contempt. The negotiations began. Milan was cold, precise, and brutal. He was not demanding money. He was demanding territory, contracts, and a public, humiliating apology. Giuseppe Rossi was sweating, his bluster gone, until his son, a hothead, slammed his hand on the table. "You do this, De Luca, you take everything, all because of some rumor, because someone pointed out your family's weakness." The word hung in the air, a lit match. Alara saw Milan's hand resting on the table clench into a fist, the scar on his knuckle turning white. She saw his other hand drift just slightly toward the inside of his jacket. The air crackled, the temperature dropping 20 degrees. His men tensed. The Rosses, realizing their mistake, recoiled. The room was a breath away from an explosion of violence. And then a small sound. Tap, tap, tap. Everyone froze. The sound was coming from the glass-walled office. Mateo was standing at the glass, looking not at the Rosses, but at his father. He had seen the tension, the shift in his father's body, and he was tapping on the glass. A slow, steady rhythm. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. It was the waltz. It was their count. Milan stared at his son. The red haze of his rage, the generations of violence humming in his blood, receded, pushed back by that simple, steady sound. He looked from his son to Alara. Her face was pale, her eyes wet, but she was steady. She nodded once, her hand finding his under the table, her fingers lacing with his. "Count it with us, Milan," she whispered, so low only he could hear. He took a deep, shuddering breath. The hand that had been moving toward his gun now rested, open, on the table. He turned his gaze back to the Rosses. The killer was gone, replaced by the chief executive officer. "My family," he said, his voice lethally calm, "is my strength, my son is my heir, and Miss Alara is my partner. You did not target a weakness, you targeted an accord." He proceeded to lay out the final terms, a bloodless, brilliant evisceration that would leave the Rosses intact, but powerless, forever neutered. He had won not with a bullet, but with a beat. Weeks later, the city was quiet. The Rosses had faded, their power broken. The DeLuca quiet hour had been a resounding success, and Alara was now a celebrated figure in the city, the planner who had turned a gala into a movement. But her real life was on the penthouse terrace, high above the city she had helped to calm. It was late. The lights of the city glittered below, a sea of diamonds. There were no shoes, just bare feet on the cool stone. A new metronome sat on the table, a beautiful, heavy piece of brass and polished wood, its steady tick-tock the only sound. Alara was leaning against the railing, and Milan came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He breathed in the scent of her hair, the familiar, clean smell that had become his only peace. "The contract is void," he murmured, his lips against her temple. She stiffened. "What? Your contract as a consultant, it's been terminated." She turned in his arms, her eyes wide and hurt. "Milan, he silenced her with a finger to her lips. "I'm not asking you to be a planner, Alara. I'm not asking you to work for me." He took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I'm asking you to stay, as my partner, as family." Her breath caught. This man of sharp edges and cold steel was offering her the one thing he held most sacred. "Matteo asked me if you were going to be his new mom," he said, a rare, rough vulnerability in his voice. "I told him I didn't know, that I had to ask you to dance first." He drew her into the center of the terrace, no music playing, only the metronome. He took her hand, placed his other on her waist, and began to lead her in their simple, silent waltz. "1, 2, 3, he whispered, his eyes locked on hers, his gray gaze no longer cold but impossibly soft, impossibly deep. Just as they found their rhythm, a small figure padded onto the terrace, headphones around his neck. Matteo, in his pajamas, blinked in the soft light. Alara smiled, holding out her free hand. "May we cut in?" she asked. Matteo smiled his bright, rare smile and stepped in, taking her hand and his father's. And there, high above the silent city, the three of them danced, a perfect, quiet, and earned accord, their steps guided by the steady, unbreakable count.